the Feast of Holy Relics. Sister Emmerich's gift of recognizing relics and blessed objects. With the gift of prophecy, Sister Emmerich had also received the power of discerning holy objects, even by the senses. Blessed bells had for her a melody all their own, a sound essentially different from every other that struck her ear. Her taste detected the blessing imparted to holy water as readily as others can distinguish water from wine. Her sense of smell aided her sight and touch in recognizing the relics of saints. And she had as lively a perception of the sacerdotal benediction sent her from afar as when given in her actual vicinity. Whether in ecstasy or the state of consciousness, she would involuntarily follow the consecrated fingers of a priest as if deriving from their influence strength and benediction. This keen perception of all that was holy, of virtues, of spiritual properties, was not conveyed to her senses by previous knowledge received in vision. It was perfectly independent of the activity of the mind and as involuntary as is the transmission of ideas to it through the medium of the senses. This faculty of realizing what the senses could not perceive had, like the gift of prophecy, its very foundation in the grace of baptism and infused faith. Her angel once said to her, "Thou perceivest the light from the bones of the saints by the same power thou dost possess of realizing the communion of the faithful." But faith is the condition on which depends the power of receiving holy influences. Sister Emmerich saw all that was holy radiant with light. "I sometimes see," she said, "if when lying fully awake, a resplendent form hovering in the air, toward which rise thousands of brilliant rays, until the two lights unite. If one of these rays should happen to break, it falls back, as it were, and darkness takes its place." This is an image of the spiritual communion of the faithful by prayer and good works. She felt the influence of this light as of something that relieved and strengthened her, something that filled her with joy and powerfully attracted her to itself. Whilst, on the contrary, she turned suddenly and involuntarily, filled with horror and disgust, from whatever was unholy, from whatever was tainted with sin. "It is very difficult to explain this clearly," she once said to the pilgrim. "I see the blessing in the blessed object endowed with a healing and helping power. I see them luminous and radiating light. Evil, crime and malediction appear before me as darkness radiating darkness and working destruction. I see light and darkness as living things enlightening or obscuring. For a long time I have had a perception of the authenticity of relics and, as I abhor the veneration of false ones, I have buried many such. My guide tells me that it is a great abuse to distribute as genuine relics objects that have only touched relics. One day whilst I was baking hosts in the convent, I felt suddenly attracted toward a certain cupboard. Indeed, I was violently drawn to it. In it I found a round box containing relics, and I had no peace until I gave them a more honorable resting place. On July the 19th, 1820, she spoke as follows: "I have been told that the gift of recognizing relics has never been bestowed upon anyone in the same degree as God has given it to me, and this on account of their being so sadly neglected and because their veneration is to be revived." These last words are fully explained by Sister Emmerich's communications on the Feast of the Holy Relics, 1819, 1820. On the first Sunday of July, 1819, she related what follows: "I had to go with my guide into all parts of our country where lay buried the bones of the saints. I saw entire bodies over which buildings had been erected and places upon which convents and churches had once stood. Here lay whole rows of bodies, among them those of some saints. In dolmen, I saw sacred relics reposing between the church and the schoolhouse, and the saints to whom they belonged appeared to me, saying, 'That is one of my bones.' I saw that these neglected treasures confer blessings wherever they lie and ward off Satan's influence. I have seen certain places preserved from serious calamities by them whilst others of recent date suffered severely, because possessing nothing of the kind. I cannot say in how many strange, out-of-the-way places, under walls, houses, and corners I have been where the richest treasures of relics lie unhonored, covered up by rubbish. I venerated them all and begged the dear saints not to withdraw their love from the poor people. I went also to the place of martyrdom in Rome and saw the multitudes of saints who there suffered death. My heavenly bridegroom there appeared to me under the form in which I am so accustomed to see him in his 12th year. The saints seemed to me innumerable. They were divided into choirs headed respectively by him who had instructed and encouraged them. They wore long white mantles with crosses and caps, from either side of which hung long flaps down to the shoulders. This vision appeared to me all the more remarkable, writes Brentano, when I discovered that the Feast of Holy Relics is celebrated at present in the Diocese of Minster, a fact wholly unknown to Sister Emmerich. Her obligation to satisfy for the negligence committed in the church is indeed wonderful. I went with them into underground caves full of passages, chambers, round apartments like chapels, into which several others opened, and in the center of which stood a pillar supporting the roof. Many of these pillars were ornamented with beautiful figures. In the walls were deep, quadrangular excavations in which reposed the bones of the dead. As we passed along, sometimes one of my guides, sometimes another would say, "I see, here we lived in time of persecution, here we taught and celebrated the mysteries of redemption." They showed me long stone altars projecting from the wall, and others round and beautifully sculptured upon which the holy sacrifice had been offered. "See," they said, "we lived here for a time in poverty and obscurity, but the light and strength of faith were ours." And after those words, the different leaders disappeared with their choir. Sometimes we came to daylight, but only again to plunge into the caves. I saw gardens, walls, and palaces overhead, and I could not understand how the people up there knew nothing of what was going on below, how all these things had been brought down into the caves, how it was all done at last. There remained with me of all the saints only one old man and a youth. We entered a spacious apartment whose form I could not determine, as I could not see its limits. It was supported by numerous pillars with sculptured capitals, and beautiful statues larger than life lay around on the ground. At one end the hall converged to a point where, standing out from the wall, was an altar, and behind it other statues. The walls were full of tombs in which rested bones, but they were not luminous. In the corners lay numberless rolls, some short and thick, others as long as one's arm, like rolls of linen. I thought they were writings. When I saw everything so well preserved, the hall so neat and cheerful, I thought it would be very nice to stay a while, to examine and arrange things, and I wondered that the people overhead guessed not of its existence. Then I had an assurance that all would come to light some day through a great catastrophe. Were I present at the time, I should try to bring it about without injuring anything. Nothing was said to me in this place. I had but to gaze. Why? I know not. And now the old man disappeared. He wore a cap like the others with lappets on the shoulders, and a long beard. Then the youth took me back home. Feast of Holy Relics, 1820. I again visited innumerable places where lie relics under buildings buried and forgotten. I went through cellars in mud and dust, into old church crypts, sacristies, tombs, and I venerated the holy things lying there, scattered and unknown. I saw how they once shone with light, how they shed around a benediction, but their veneration ceased with the decline of the church. The churches erected over them are dark and desolate, the saints under them are no longer honored. I saw that their veneration and that of their relics had decreased in the same measure as the adoration of the most blessed sacrament, and then I was shown how evil a thing it is to receive the Holy Eucharist through mere habit. Grievous sufferings were imposed upon me for this contempt. In the spiritual church I saw the value and efficacy of the holy relics now so little regarded on earth. I saw an octangular church arising like a lily from a stalk and surrounded by a vine. It had no altar, but in the center, a many-branched candlestick, reposed the richest treasures of the church like bunches of opening flowers. I saw the holy things collected and honorably placed by the saints on this candlestick, this ornamental stand, which seemed constantly to increase in size. Whilst thus engaged, the saints very often saw their own relics brought in by those who lived after them. I saw the disciples of St. John bringing in his head and other relics of him, and the Blessed Virgin with little crystal phials of the blood of Jesus. In one of them the blood was still clear and shining. All were in the costly reliquaries in which the church preserves them. I saw saintly men and women of Mary's time depositing in precious vases, holy things that once belonged to her. They were given the place of honor on the right. There was a crystal vase shaped like a breast in which was some of her milk, also pieces of her clothing, and another vase with some of her hair. I saw a tree before the church, and I was shown how it had fallen and been fashioned into the Saviour's cross. I saw it now in the form in which I always see it, brought in by a woman wearing a crown. It hovered in the air over Mary's relics. The 3 nails were stuck in it, the little foot ledge was in its place, as also the inscription, and, skillfully arranged around, were the instruments of the Passion. The ladder, the lance, the sponge, the rods, the whips, the crowbars, the pillar, the cords, the hammers, etc., whilst the crown of thorns hung from the center. As the sacred objects were brought in and arranged, I had successive visions of the places in which these relics of the Passion were found, and I felt certain that of all I saw some particles are still preserved and honored. There must be many relics of the crown of thorns in different places. I discovered that my particle of the lance is from the haft. I saw in all directions, on altars, in chambers, churches, vaults, in walls, in rubbish, under the earth and on the earth, portions of the relics and bones which were brought into the church. Many consecrated hosts in chalices and ciboriums were brought thither by bishops and corporals stained with the precious blood. They were placed on high over the cross. Then came the relics of the apostles and the early martyrs, followed by those of whole bands of martyrs. Popes, priests, confessors, hermits, virgins, religious, etc. They were deposited at the foot of the cross, in costly vases, ornamented caskets, towers, and shrines wonderfully wrought in precious metal. A mountain of treasures arose under the cross, which gradually ascended as the mound increased and, finally, rested upon what might be termed the transfigured Calvary. The relics were brought by those who had themselves honored them and exposed them to the veneration of the faithful. They were, for the most part, holy personages whose own relics are now held in benediction. All the saints whose relics were present ranged in choirs, according to their rank and profession. The church became more and more crowded. The heavens opened and the splendor of glory gleamed around. It was like the heavenly Jerusalem. The relics were surrounded by the aureolas of the saints to whom they belonged, whilst the saints themselves sent forth rays of the same colors, thus establishing a visible and marvelous connection between them and their remains. After this I saw multitudes of well-dressed people thronging around the church with marks of deep veneration. They wore the various costumes of their times. Of the present day, I saw but few. They were people who honored the saints and their relics as they ought to be honored, as members of the body of Jesus Christ, as holy vessels of divine grace through Jesus, in Jesus. On them I saw falling like a celestial dew the beneficent influence of those saints. Prosperity crowned all their undertakings. I rejoiced to see here and there, in these our days, some good souls, some of whom I know still honoring relics in all simplicity. They belong chiefly to the peasantry. They salute simply and earnestly the relics in the church as they enter. To my great joy, I saw my brother among them. As he enters the church, he devoutly invokes the holy relics it contains, and I see that the saints give fertility to his fields. The veneration paid the saints and their relics in the present day, I saw symbolized by a ruined church in which they lay scattered, neglected, covered with dust, yes, even thrown among filth and dirt. And yet they still shed light around, still draw down a blessing. The church itself was in as pitiable a state as the relics. The faithful still frequented it, but they looked like grim shadows. Only occasionally was a simple, devout soul to be seen who was clear and luminous. The worst of all were the priests themselves, who seemed to be buried in mist, unable to take one step forward. They would not have been able to find the church door were it not that, in spite of their neglect, a few fine rays from the forgotten relics still reached them through the mist. Then I had distinct visions of the origin of the veneration of relics. I saw altars erected over the remains of the saints which, by the blessing of God, afterward became chapels and churches, but which were now in ruins owing to the neglect of their sacred treasures. I saw in the time in which all was misty and dark, the beautiful reliquaries broken up to make money and their contents scattered around, which latter desecration gave rise to greater evils than did even the selling of the caskets. The churches in which these sacrileges happened have fallen to decay, and many have even wholly disappeared. I have been to Rome, Cologne, and Isla Chapel, where I saw treasures of relics to which certain honors are paid in consequence of the dismantling of churches and the suppression of convents. Innumerable sacred relics had been scattered and profaned and had finally fallen into irreverent hands. This was a source of deep sorrow to Sister Emmerich, who sought every opportunity to revive veneration toward these holy objects. People soon discovered that they could not give the poor invalid greater pleasure than by bringing her something of the kind, or asking her advice on the subject. In this way she accumulated quite a treasure of holy things. More than 300 genuine relics, with whose whole history she was perfectly familiar, were in her possession at the time of her death. She had received them principally from Dean Overberg, Father Limburg, the Pilgrim, and others, who knew of her ability to recognize such things. If she found any spurious among those presented to her, she had them buried in consecrated ground. The others constituted her spiritual treasure, upon which she had at various times lights more or less clear, as God ordained that the gift he had bestowed upon his servant should tend to the restoration of the honor due his saints. Sister Emmerich's recognition of relics was a grace which, in accordance with the designs of God, was intimately connected with the mission of her life, and it was for this reason that her angelic guide guarded it so jealously against the caprice, vain curiosity, or love of the marvelous, which might actuate those who submitted it to the test of trial. One day Clara Seaton brought her a little packet of relics. Sister Emmerich took it, saying, "Oh, this is a great treasure. Here are relics of St. Peter, his stepdaughter Petronilla, Lazarus, Martha, and Magdalene. It was brought from Rome long ago. This is the way the saints' bones lie around when they pass from church into private hands. This reliquary was first bequeathed as an inheritance, then given away among old worthless things, and at last it fell by chance into Clara Seutkin's possession. I must have the relics honored." On another occasion, a Jewess found among some old clothing she had purchased a reliquary which she forcibly opened. But, terrified at her own act, she hurried with the relics to Sister Emmerich, who had witnessed the whole affair in vision. She could not help smiling at the woman's fright. It was only at the close of those investigations which so closely scrutinized Sister Emmerich's whole life, both interior and exterior, that God provided occasions for the manifestation of the extraordinary gifts of his servant. He willed the perfection of her virtue to prove the reality of her supernatural gifts, rather than that the latter should be made the touchstone of her holiness. The first trial made with false relics and condemned by her angel, is thus recorded by the Pilgrim under date of August 30th, 1820. The parish priest had sent to Sister Emmerich 3 small packages of bones by Christian Brentano, the Pilgrim's brother. At the Pilgrim's request one of them was laid by her. The next day she related the following: "I saw far away dark, desolate tombs full of black bones, and I did not feel that they were holy. I saw the Father take some of them, and then I found myself up high in the dark chapel around which all was cold and bleak and foggy. My guide left me, and I saw a stately figure approaching me with a most gracious air. At first I thought it was an angel, but soon I trembled with fright. I asked, 'Who art thou?' The answer came in 2 unknown words. I thought of them all the morning, but now I cannot recall them. They signified, 'Corrupter of Babylon, seducer of Judah.' Then the figure said, 'I am the spirit that reared Semiramis of Babylon and built up her empire. I am he who brought about thy redemption, for I made Judas seize him.' He named not Christ, and this he said with an important air, as if wishing to impress me with the greatness of his exploits. I made the sign of the cross on my forehead, whereupon he grew horrible to behold. He began to rage furiously against me for having once snatched a young girl from him, and then he disappeared uttering fearful threats. As he pronounced the first of the unknown words, I saw Semiramis as a little girl under some beautiful trees, the same spirit standing before her and offering her all kinds of fruits. The child looked up at him unthinkingly, and, although she was very beautiful, there was something repulsive about her. She seemed to be full of thorns, full of talons. The spirit nourished her, and gave her all sorts of gewgaws. The country around was lovely. It was covered with tents, green meadows, whole herds of elephants and other animals with their keepers. It was shown me also how Semiramis raged against God's people, how she drove Melchizedek from her realm and committed many other abominations. And yet, she was almost adored. At the second word the Spirit pronounced, I had a vision of Christ on Mount Olivet, the treason of Judas, and the whole of the bitter passion. I do not understand why this Spirit appeared to me. Perhaps these are pagan bones and, consequently, the enemy has power to approach me. My guide has strictly forbidden me ever to take such bones again. I tell thee, he said, in the name of Jesus, it is a dangerous experiment. There is treachery in it. Thou mightest be seriously injured by it. We must not cast pearls before swine. That is, before the unbelieving, for pearls should be set in gold. Attend to such relics only as come to thee by the direction of God. In September following, Some relics were sent to her by a priest who had visited her in Dolmen. Sister Emmerich remarked, "I have had no particular vision concerning these relics. But I saw that the priest who sent them is a good man, although there are in his parish certain souls inclining to pietism not in accordance with the spirit of the Church. He cannot detect them, he thinks them very devout. But I have seen them spreading darkness all around. They make little account of the ceremonies of our Holy Church. They have not openly declared themselves as yet. The evil is, however, in them." Then I heard a voice repeating near me, "Thou forgettest me. Thou forgettest me." It was a warning from the other relics, and I was again told not to accept any more unknown relics to recognize even if brought me by the holiest priest in the world, for serious harm might result to me from it. I must arrange what I have first. Very little notice, however, was paid to the prohibitions so earnestly repeated by the poor invalid. Curiosity triumphed over other considerations. The pilgrim not long after presented her, whilst in ecstasy, a little packet of relics from 2 Rhenish convents. They had been sent him by a friend. Sister Emmerich took them unsuspectingly, thinking them her own. But the next day she said, "My guide has severely reprimanded me for taking those relics contrary to his orders and, consequently, I have quite forgotten all that I saw." He again repeated that it is not the time to recognize unknown relics, and my too ready acceptance of them might entirely mislead me. The gift of recognizing such things is not a privilege to be called into play at every moment. It is a special grace. The time will soon come for me to use it, but not now. My guide also bade me remember the cure and his package, the thoughtless remarks he had made somewhere about myself and my relics, and that such remarks might do much harm. I must for the future refuse such things and meddle with none but my own. The same warning was again repeated, and she was told that the pilgrim's friend, an enthusiastic supporter of the theory of mesmerism, was merely trying experiments on her which might have very serious consequences, as her gifts were not what he thought. They were not subject to her own good pleasure, not a natural faculty to be employed at the discretion of the curious. The pilgrim submitted, but not so his friend, who still found excuses for testing her wonderful powers. On the 12th of December, she again declared, "Your friend's judgment of me and of what he sees in me is false. Consequently, I have been expressly forbidden by my guide to receive even a saint's relic from him. He only wants to make experiments which may prove very injurious to me. And besides, he speaks of them publicly and in a manner quite opposed to the real state of the case. My gifts, my means of knowing, are not what he imagines. I see the drift of his thoughts when he speaks with me. He is wrong concerning me. I was long ago warned of it in vision." On December the 16th, Sister Emmerich said, "I have had a wonderfully clear vision on the subject of relics, which I saw all around me and in many churches on the banks of the Rhine. I saw a coach attacked by robbers, and a little box of relics thrown from it into a field on the roadside. The owner returned to seek it, but in vain. It was found by another person who kept it for some time. In it I saw the bone, brought here by the friend, but I must not name it. The friend must wait until his heart is changed. He is still surpassingly high and broad in his views. Faith, also, is high and broad. But it must often pass through a keyhole. The friend is obstinate in his erroneous opinion of me and my mission. His ideas on this point are strange and unreasonable. Therefore, have I received positive commands to have nothing to do with relics coming from him. His views are false, he publishes them unnecessarily, and he may thereby bring trouble upon me. My time is not yet come." December the 21st, St. Thomas's Day. The pilgrim, on entering to pay his accustomed visit, found Sister Emmerich busily engaged with her box of relics, her church, as she playfully called it. Among them she had discovered several very ancient ones. The pilgrim was surprised to see in what beautiful order she had arranged them during the previous night. Although in a state of contemplation, she had lined the box with silk as neatly as if she had been wide awake. The 5 relics of St. James the Less, St. Simon the Cananian, St. Joseph of Arimathea, St. Denis the Areopagite, and a disciple of St. John, whom she called Eliot, she had folded separately. "I had," she exclaimed, "a very bright night. I found out the names of all the bones by me, and I saw all the journeys of St. Thomas, as also those of all the apostles and disciples whose relics I have. I had a vision of the great festival and of how all these relics came to Munster. They were collected by a foreign bishop at a very remote period, and they afterward fell into the hands of a bishop of Munster. I saw all with the dates and names, and I trust in God it will not be lost. I received permission, also, to reveal to my confessor the name of the relic that the friend brought me that he may note it down. But I must not tell the friend himself. The friend, however, would not understand these words so indicative of Sister Emmerich's bond with the Church and the supernatural origin of her marvelous gift. And she, seeing his ideas still unchanged, felt a lively desire to make known to him the secret name. She says most ingenuously, "Ah! I thought, if I could only tell him the name of that relic." And I had a word on my tongue when all at once a shining white hand was stretched forth from the closet there and laid on my lips to prevent my uttering it. It came so suddenly, so unexpectedly that I almost laughed out. This scene was repeated under almost similar circumstances a few days later when she was again seized with desire to gratify the friend's curiosity on the score of the relic he had given her. I was again tempted to name the saint whose relic had caused me so much annoyance. But just as I was about to pronounce it, I heard a rapping in the closet which checked me, and I dared not, I could not say it. More than once I have had the word on my tongue, but I could not speak it, although I wanted to do so. Her confessor and the friend had likewise heard the rapping in the closet and were unable to account for it. But when the former exclaimed, "The evil one shall play us no tricks," Sister Emmerich quietly took the relic from the closet, saying, "It is the saint the pilgrim's friend brought." We shall here subjoin some facts which clearly show the power of the priest over this chosen soul. On January 18, 1821, Father Limburg placed by Sister Emmerich a little sealed package, saying to the pilgrim as he did so, "I do not know what it contains. But when she notices it, I shall tell her where I got it." Then, turning to the invalid he asked, "What is this? Is it good? Tell me what it is." Although interrupted in her vision, Sister Emmerich answered after a short pause, "It belongs to a pious man in the seminary at Paris. He brought it from Jerusalem and Rome. It contains various things, some hair belonging to a pope, a particle of the body of a new saint who died in a convent in the Holy Land, a small stone from the Holy Sepulchre, some earth from the spot on which our Lord's body lay, and some hair belonging to another person." The pilgrim remarked to Father Limburg, "You found it, I presume, among the Abbé Lambert's effects, for he received similar objects from Paris." "Yes," replied Father Limburg. "In arranging his papers, I found the little parcel, and with these words he left the room." "Who is that miserable little nun?" exclaimed the invalid. "The father said nothing to me about her. He ought to go see her. She is much worse off than I. She is lying in the midst of thorns." Sister Emmerich saw herself under this figure, because the sealed parcel contained some of her own hair which the old Abbé intended to send to his friend. One day she recognized a relic as belonging to a holy pope whose name, however, she failed to recall. The pilgrim begged the confessor to present it to her once more. He did so, and she held it but a few seconds when she exclaimed confidently, "It is a relic of Pope Boniface, August the 9th, 1821. Sister Emmerich said, "I was busy all last night with the sacred bones. I saw all the saints, and I was told to say as many Our Fathers as there are relics, for the souls of all resting here in our cemetery." The following fact will show in a most striking manner the powerful impression made upon Sister Emmerich by profane, as well as by holy objects. The pilgrim records under date of May the 9th, 1820, Dr. Wesener, whilst excavating a pagan tomb, found a vase of ashes with which were mingled some fragments of a human skull. The pilgrim placed one on Sister Emmerich's couch as she lay absorbed in ecstatic prayer. But she who was so powerfully attracted by the relics of the saints, as to move her head, her hands, her whole person trembling in every muscle after them, let this bone lie unnoticed on the coverlet near the fingers of her left hand. The pilgrim thought it an object of indifference to her, when she suddenly exclaimed, "What does that old Rebecca want with me?" And when he moved the bone a little nearer, she hid her hands under the coverlet, crying out that a swarthy old savage woman was running around the room followed by children naked like frogs. She could not look at her. She was afraid. She had seen such dark, wild people in Egypt, but she knew not what this old woman wanted with her, etc. Then catching up her box of relics, she pressed it to her bosom with both hands, saying, though still in ecstasy, now she cannot hurt me. And she slipped under the coverlet. The pilgrim put the bone in his pocket and stepped to the side of her bed toward which her face was turned. But instantly she changed her posture. He returned to the opposite side, and again she as quickly averted her head. At last, he removed the unholy object from her presence, when she exclaimed with a sigh of relief that the saints had preserved her. During this scene, her confessor held out to her his consecrated finger, toward which she moved her head so quickly as to seize it with her lips and press it eagerly. "What is that?" he demanded. Instantly came the astonishing answer, "It is more than thou dost comprehend." Then he withdrew his finger and laid his hand on the foot of the bed where, too, she tried to follow. Rigid in ecstasy and still clasping her box, she arose to a sitting posture and endeavored to reach the consecrated fingers with her lips. Then the pilgrim laid near the hand that clasped the box of relics, a fragment of the fossil remains of some animal which the doctor had found in the lip. Sister Emmerich willingly received it, saying, "Ah, this is all right. There is nothing hurtful about this. It is a good animal. It never committed sin." Then she exhorted the pilgrim not to meddle with heathen bones, not to bring them to her mixed up with the bones of the saints. "Go, throw that old woman away. Take care, she might hurt you," she exclaimed earnestly at intervals. Some days after, when the pilgrim alluded to the incidents just related, Sister Emmerich severely represented to him how improper, how dangerous it was for him to make such experiments upon her, to mingle thus the sacred with the profane, and to expose her to unbecoming impressions. "Pagan bones repel me, fill me with disgust and loathing. I cannot say that I actually felt that the woman is damned, but I perceived around her something sinister, something that turns away from God, that spreads around darkness, or rather that is darkness itself, quite contrary to the luminous, attractive, beneficent bones of the saints." The old woman glanced around furtively, as if in connection with the powers of evil, as if she herself could harm. All round her, forest and heath, lay in darkness. Not in the darkness of night, but in spiritual darkness, the darkness of wicked doctrines, in the darkness of separation from the light of the world, in the covenant of darkness. I saw only the woman and her children, but there were miserable huts of various forms scattered here and there, sunk in the earth, surmounted, some by round odd roofs, others by square-reed ones, and some again by conical ones. Between most of these huts were underground passages. The unholy, heathenish influence of such remains may produce much evil if made use of for unlawful superstitious practices. They who so use them become thereby, though unknown to themselves, participators in their influence. They establish a communication with them, just as the veneration of holy relics imparts a share in the benediction, the sanctifying influence of what is redeemed and regenerated. It was not only in vision, but also in the natural state of consciousness that Sister Emmerich felt the attractive influence of holy relics, saw them shining, and knew their names. A fact to which the pilgrim testifies in his journal of December 30th, 1818, Sister Newhouse, he says, Sister Emmerich's former mistress of novices, came to see her bringing with her a small package. As she entered the room, the invalid experienced, as she herself said, a thrill of joy and an interior conviction that the package contained relics. "Ah," she exclaimed, "you bring the treasure from your room and you keep there the dust." And when Sister Newhouse laid the parcel on the table near her, so great was her emotion that she feared every moment she would be ravished in ecstasy. It was with the greatest effort that she could entertain her visitor, her attention being powerfully drawn to the relics. Sister Newhouse asked if she were unusually sick. "Not perfectly well," was the answer, and then she spoke of indifferent subjects, hoping to divert her mind from its all-absorbing object. An interior voice seemed to be calling out to her, "There is Lodger. There he is." After the sister left, the invalid said, "I saw the whole time over the relic a glimmering of light, white as milk and brighter than the day. And, when the particle fell on the floor, I saw, as it were, a bright spark drop under the box. As the pilgrim looked over the relics, I was almost ravished, and I heard a voice, exclaiming, 'There is Lodger. That is his bone.' And instantly I beheld the holy bishop with mitre and crozier in the assembly of the saints. Then others were shown me, one by one. First, Scholastica above a troop of nuns, and her relic on the table. Then Aphra surrounded by nuns, and her relic on the table. Benedict over a crowd of monks, and his relic on the table. Walburga with her nuns, and her relic below by the pilgrim. Among the nuns one was pointed out as Emmerich, and I heard these words, "That is Emmerich, and there is her bone." I was surprised, for I had never heard that name before. Then I saw a maiden with a crown of double roses round her brow, holding in one hand a lovely garland of roses, in the other a bouquet, and I heard these words, "That is Rosalie who did so much for the poor. She now holds the flower garland as she once did her pious gifts, and there lies her relic." Then I saw a nun in a shining troop, and I was told, "That is Ludovica, and there is her relic. See how she scatters her gifts," and I saw that she had her apron full of loaves which she distributed to the poor. Then I saw a bishop and heard the words, "He lived in Ludger's time." They knew each other. They labored together, and yet I saw them far apart. And now, among other blessed maidens, I saw a very young secular clothed in a spiritual garment of the style of the Middle Ages. Her body had been found incorrupt and entire. Her sanctity had thus been recognized, and one of her bones was placed among other relics. At the same time, I saw her open tomb. Then I saw a delicate youth of the early ages, and near him 6 others and a woman. The name Felicitas was pronounced, and, immediately, a round place enclosed by walls and arches was shown me, and I was told that in the dens on one side were the wild beasts, and in the prisons opposite the martyrs in chains waiting to be torn to pieces. I saw also people digging by night and carrying off bones, and it was said to me, "They do this secretly. They are the martyrs' friends." In this way their relics are carried to Rome and distributed. I saw Felicitas near 7 youths. A week later, the pilgrim presented Sister Emmerich with the rest of the relics in Sister Newhouse's package. I gave her 7 parcels, he says, all of which he recognized as belonging to Saint Elizabeth of Thuringia. "I see Elizabeth," she exclaimed, "a crown in one hand, in the other a little basket from which fall golden roses, large and small, on a poor beggar below." Here she pointed to a relic, saying, "That is Barbara. I see her with a crown on her head and in her hand a chalice with the blessed sacrament." Then turning to another little paper, she said, "These are from the place of martyrdom in Rome." With these words she fell into ecstasy and described the places she saw and the sufferings of the martyrs, whilst, at the same time, she named the relics and presented them to the pilgrim to fold and label. He was amazed at the rapidity of her speech and movements. He expressed his astonishment in these words, "I must acknowledge, to my shame, that of such things I know almost nothing. Fancy to yourself this poor peasant girl gazing on ancient Rome, describing its mariners and customs. She understands all that she sees, even the moral state of the martyrs. And yet, her inexperience is such that, for the most part, she knows not how to name the objects, the localities, the instruments that fall under her eyes." At the close of her vision, she asked her guide how these relics had come where they were, and why they had not received the honor due them. He answered that they had been exhumed long ago, had passed from place to place, and had at last reached Minster. Here they had been put aside to make way for other things. "I was in a strange, wonderful city," she says. "I stood on top of the round building enclosing the circular place. Over the entrance, right and left, ran an inside staircase to where I was. On one side were prisons opening into the enclosure. On the other, the cages of the wild beasts. Behind these were nooks into which the executioners slipped when they released the animals. Facing the entrance against the wall, was a stone seat up to which steps led on either side. Here sat the wife of the wicked emperor with 2 tyrants. Just back of this seat, upon the platform, sat a man who appeared to superintend affairs, for he made gestures right and left as if commanding something. And now the door of one of the cages was thrown open, and out dashed a spotted animal like a huge cat. The executioners stood behind the door, slipped into the nook for safety, and then mounted the steps to the platform. Meanwhile, 2 other executioners had dragged a maiden from the prison opposite and removed her white tunic. Like all the martyrs she shone with light. She stood calmly in the middle of the arena with raised eyes and hands crossed on her breast. She showed no sign of fear. The beast did her no harm but, crouching before her, sprang upon the slaves who were urging it on with spears and cries. As it would I not attack her, They got it back into its cage, I know not how. The maiden was then led to another place of execution around which there were only railings. She was fastened to a stone by a stake, her hands bound behind her, and beheaded. I saw her put her hands behind her back herself. Her hair was braided round her head. She was lovely, and she showed no fear. Then a man was led out into the arena. His mantle was removed, and only an undergarment left that reached to his knees. The beasts did him no harm, and he, too, was beheaded. He was, like the maiden, pushed from side to side and pricked with sharp iron rods. These grievous tortures were borne with such joy that the looker-on can but regret not sharing them. Sometimes the executioners themselves are wonderfully affected by the sublime spectacle that they boldly join the martyrs, confess Jesus Christ, and suffer with them. I see a martyr in the arena. A lioness pounces upon him, drags him from side to side, and tears him to pieces. I see others burned alive, and one from whom the flames turn away and seize upon the executioners, of whom numbers perish. A priest who secretly consoled the sufferers has his limbs cut off one by one and presented to him in the hope of making him abjure his faith. But the mutilated body, full of joy, praises God until the head is struck off. I went, also, into the catacombs. I saw men and women kneeling in prayer before a table on which were lights. One priest recited prayers, and another burned incense in a vase. All seemed to offer something in a dish placed on the table. The prayers were like a preparation for martyrdom. Then I saw a noble lady with 3 daughters, from 16 to 20 years of age, led into the arena. The judge seated on high was not the same that I had last seen. Several beasts were let loose upon the Christians, but they harmed them not. They even fawned upon the youngest. The martyrs were now led before the judge, and then to the other place of execution nearby. The eldest was first burned with black torches on the cheeks and breasts and under the arms, and pincers applied to her whole body, after which she was conducted back before the judge. She noticed him not, however, for she was intent upon her sister whom they were now torturing. The same happened to all 4, and then they were beheaded. The mother was reserved for the last, her sufferings intensified by the sight of her daughter's torments. I saw a holy pope betrayed, dragged from the catacombs, and martyred, whilst one of the most furious of the Romans, suddenly touched with repentance, rushed among the martyrs and perished with them. I longed so for the same favor that I cried out, but a voice said to me, "Everyone goes his own way. We suffered martyrdom but once, but thou art constantly martyred. We had one enemy, thou hast many." On another occasion, the pilgrim offered the invalid some relics which she took, pressed to her heart, arranged in order, again pressed to her heart, and regarded attentively. Then she gave them back separately, removing one from the lot as spurious and exclaiming, "They are grand. No words can describe their beauty." To the question as to what she experienced from the sacred bones, she answered, "I see, I feel the light. It is like a ray that pierces me, ravishes me. I feel its connection with the glorified Spirit, with the whole world of light. I see pictures from the life of the saint, and his place in the church triumphant. There is a wonderful connection between body and soul, a connection which ceases not with death. Consequently, the blessed soul can continue its influence over the faithful through particles of its earthly remains. It will be very easy for the angels to separate the good from the bad at the last day, for all will be either light or dark." On July the 31st, whilst trapped in contemplation, Sister Emmerich took her little box of relics and, from among more than 100, chose out one particle which she said belonged to St. Ignatius of Loyola. On returning to wakefulness, she began again to hunt up fragments belonging to one another, and in about 5 minutes she had made up 6 separate piles. Of one of them she said, "I ought to have 10 pieces." She counted again, but found only 9. "There ought to be 10," she repeated. At last, she found the 10th. She fell back exhausted, saying, "I can do no more. I can see no more." After a pause, she exclaimed, "I felt irresistibly drawn to look for these relics. They attracted me, and I sighed for them. It is easy to recognize them at such times, for they shine with a different light. I see little pictures like the faces of the saints to whom they belong, toward which rays of light dart from the particles. I cannot express it. It was a wonderful state. It is as if one felt something confined in one's breast that strives to get free. The effort fatigues, exhausts. Opening a paper, she remarked, "Here is a little stone," and she picked it out from among many others precisely similar. She had no need of light for this occupation. Indeed, she often performed it by night. The vicar Hilgenberg, having arranged some relics very elegantly, brought them to show the invalid. She was delighted with them. She said, "I see some of them surrounded by an aureola of various colors. They shine with light, they are perfectly transparent. On looking more closely, I see a tiny figure which gradually increases in size until I behold the form, the clothing, demeanor, life, history, and name of the saint. The names are always under the feet for men, at the right side for women. Only the first syllable is written, the rest I perceive interiorly. The letters are surrounded by an aureola of the same colors as the relics of the saints to whom they belong. It seems as if the names were something essential, something substantial. There is a mystery in them. When I see the saints in a general way, without reference to my recognizing them, they appear to be in hierarchies and choirs, clothed according to their rank in the costume of the church triumphant, and not in that of the time in which they lived. Popes, bishops, kings, or the anointed, the martyrs, the virgins, etc., are in heavenly garments surrounded by glory. The sexes are not separated. The virgins have an entirely distinct, mystical rank. They were either voluntary virgins, or chaste married women, or martyrs to whom the executioners offered violence. I see Magdalene in a high rank, but not among the virgins. She was tall, beautiful, and so attractive that, had she not been converted to Jesus, she would have become a female monster. She gained a great victory. Sometimes I see only the saints' heads, sometimes the whole bust radiant with colored light. The glory of virgins and those who have led a tranquil life, whose combats have been only those of patience in daily trials, in domestic troubles, is white as snow, and it is the same for youths whom I often see with lilies in their hands. They who were martyred by secret sufferings for the honor of Jesus shine with a pale red light. The martyrs have bright red aureolas and palms in their hands. The confessors and doctors are yellow and green, like a rainbow, and they bear green branches. The martyrs are in different colored glory, according to the various degrees of torments they endured. Among my relics I see some saints who became martyrs by the interior martyrdom of the soul without the shedding of blood. I see the angels without aureolas. They appear to me, indeed, under a human form with faces and hair, but they are more delicate, more noble, more beautiful than men. They are immaterial, perfectly luminous and transparent, but in different degrees. I see blessed souls surrounded by a material light, rather white than resplendent, and around them a many-colored glory, an aureola whose tints correspond to their kind of purification. I see neither angels nor saints moving their feet, excepting in the historic scenes of their life upon earth, as men among men. I never see these apparitions in their real state speaking to one another with the mouth. They turn to one another, interpenetrate one another. Among Sister Emmerich's relics were two of St. Hildegard, one small, the other larger, a piece of the hip bone. One day she looked up with an air of surprise, as if someone were approaching her. "Who is it in a long white robe?" she asked. And then, turning to the little closet by her, she said, "It is Hildegard. I have two relics of her, one large which I do not often find, and a smaller one which is always coming to hand. The large one is less luminous. It belongs to a less noble part, for bonds differ in dignity. So, too, the garments worn by Magdalene before her conversion shine less than the others. The members lost by a saint before his second birth are relics, since all mankind, even before the coming of Jesus, were redeemed through him. The relics, the holy bones are pure, chaste, courageous souls are firmer, more solid than those of persons agitated by passions. Consequently, the bones belonging to the simple old times are firmer and more attractive than those of a later period. The pilgrim brought her a little box containing about 50 fragments of relics all lying together. As the invalid was at the moment perfectly conscious, in the waking state, he remarked that it would be a good time to sort and arrange them. Sister Emmerich assented and set to work earnestly, putting the particles of the same body by themselves, and even designating to what members they belonged. "These," she said, picking up some scraps, "were once in fire. I now see people hunting for them in the ashes. These were in the city church, and I see how they cleaned and prepared them. Those there are very brilliant, these less so. And there is one, pointing to it, that sheds around a particularly beautiful golden red light. Here she fell into contemplation, from which she soon returned with the words, I see an old palsied man, lying on a bed in an open square. A bishop, with a crozier resting on his arm, is leaning over him, his head upon his shoulder, whilst his attendants stand around with lighted torches, and she pointed out the relic with the beautiful light as connected with this scene, naming it Servulus. She also named Saint Quirinus in connection with one of these relics. The pilgrim brought her a small packet of relics belonging to the castle of Dolmen. It contained 8 scraps of old stuff which she laid aside with the words, it was once worn by a saint. It is a piece of a stole, a vestment which touched a holy thing. When asked how she knew that, she answered that ever since the package entered her room, she had seen 4 saints by her clothed in this stuff. They had cut and touched it, and again they appeared to her as she was picking out the shreds. The pilgrim inquired if she did not see Saint Thecla, whose relic lay by her. Yes, was the answer, I see her, now here, now there, in a vision, as if on the watch near the prison in which St. Paul is confined. Sometimes I see her gliding along by a wall, sometimes under an arch, like a person anxiously seeking something. Picking up a splinter of bronze wood wrapped in blue, she said, this is a piece of the wood of which the cross Mary had at Ephesus was made. It is cedar wood, and the scrap of blue silk belonged to a mantle that once clothed an image of Mary. It is very old. On November the 6th, 1821, Sister Emmerich found among her relics a scrap of wood which she gave the pilgrim, saying, this was brought from the Holy Land long ago by a pilgrim. It was taken from a tree which stood in the little garden of an Essenian. Jesus was carried up over it by the tempter at the close of his 40 days fast. Then she handed another package to him. Here, she said, is some earth from Mount Sinai. I see the mountain by it. Taking up a bone, she said, it belongs to a saint of July. His name begins with E. I saw him in prison with 2 others whom starvation forced to suck the bones of the dead. When led forth to martyrdom, he was, on account of his wonderful discourse on God, looked upon as a fool, and they wanted to free him. But one of the soldiers cried out, oh, let us see if he can call his God down from heaven. He is as worthy of martyrdom as the others. And the blasphemous wretch was immediately struck by lightning. Then I saw the saint celebrating divine service in a church, after which he was martyred. History of a Reliquary. November the 8th, 1819. When the pilgrim visited Sister Emmerich on this day, he brought with him in his breast pocket an old cross containing relics which she had never seen. As he approached her bed, she cried out, oh, here comes a whole procession. And she extended her hand toward the cross which he had not yet removed from his pocket. He handed it to her. Opening it eagerly, she exclaimed, here they all are, and one old man as upright as a Swiss hermit. The pilgrim left the cross with her, and next day she related the following history. As this reliquary approached, I saw in the order in which the relics lie, the saints hovering in the air in the form of a cross. Below lay a wild, woody country with a mass of dense underwood. I saw also some people, among whom was one old man like the old Swiss hermit. Then I had a vision referring to the cross. In a woody valley among mountains near the sea, I saw a hermitage of 6 female recluses, and I beheld their whole way of life. They were all young enough to help themselves. They were very silent, retired, and poor, keeping by them no provisions whatever, but depending wholly upon alms. They lived under a superior and recited the canonical hours. They wore a coarse, brown habit with a cowl. In front of their cells were neat little gardens which they cultivated themselves. Each had its own entrance and contained orange trees. Here I saw the recluses. I saw them occupied also in some labor new to me. On a machine like a loom were stretched cords which they wove into various colored carpets, coarse but very neat. They also did beautiful basket work out of fine white straw. They slept on the ground, on a plank with 2 coverlets and a poor pillow, and they ate scarcely anything cooked. They took their meals together off the table in which holes were hollowed out to serve for plates. On either side swung leaves which could be raised to cover these stationary plates. I saw them eating a brownish-looking stew of vegetables. The greatest simplicity reigned also in the chapel. Whatever there was beautiful in it was of plaited straw, I thought, here are golden prayers and straw ornaments. But we have prayers of straw and gilded ornaments. The stone altar was covered with a beautiful straw matting, scalloped on either side and falling at the ends. In the center stood a small tabernacle on which was that same cross that the pilgrim has. 2 wooden candlesticks and a pair of wooden vases, with bouquets very symmetrically arranged in the form of a monstrance, stood on either side. The little convent was a square, stone building with a shingle roof. The rooms were partitioned off by boxwood wickerwork, the openings about as large as one's hand, and they were of various heights. In the chapel they were higher than a man, though they did not reach the roof. But in the cells they were lower, the recluses could see over them. They were woven on rods fixed in the walls. The entrance, which faced the sea, led into the kitchen which opened into the refectory with its singular table. Behind was the chapel. To the right and left were 3 cells before which lay the little gardens. The doors leading into them from the cells were in the form of an arch, low and narrow, and the windows were over the doors, so that the inmates could not look out. Before the windows were straw mats that could be raised on sticks like screens. The straw stools had no backs, only a wooden handle to raise them. The chapel was covered with the coarse striped carpet which the recluses made themselves. They did not have Mass every Sunday, but a hermit came, from time to say it for them and give them Holy Communion. They kept the Blessed Sacrament, however, in their little chapel. I saw them one evening at prayer in their chapel when they were attacked by pirates. They had short, broad swords, wore turbans on their head, and they spoke a strange tongue. They often carried off people into slavery. They were very savage, almost like beasts. Their vessel was large and lay at some distance from the shore to which they came in a small boat. They destroyed the hermitage and dragged off the recluses, but without offering them insult. One of the religious, still young and robust, took the reliquary from the altar as a protection, fervently imploring God's assistance. Before the robbers reached the shore, they quarreled over their prey and, during their struggle, the young girl crept into a thicket, vowing to serve God in the wilderness if he would deliver her. The pirates sought her long, but in vain. At daybreak she saw them embark. Kneeling before the cross, she thanked God. The wilderness lay in a narrow, deep valley, snow-capped mountains on either side, far away from any road. No people, no hunters ever came there. The recluse sought long for a suitable place, and found deep in the forest a little clearing surrounded by trees and thorn bushes. It was sufficiently large for a small house. The trees almost entirely hid it overhead, and their roots spread over the ground. Here she resolved to serve God far away from mankind, destitute of both spiritual and human assistance. She built an altar of stones, placed upon it the cross, her only treasure, and arranged a little place wherein to take repose. She had no fire. She needed none, for it burned in her own heart. For nearly 30 years she never saw bread. High up in the mountains were animals like goats sleeping among the crags, and around the dwelling of the hermitess were white hares and birds of the size of a chicken. At last, a hunter in the service of a lord whose castle was some miles off, came with his hounds into the neighborhood. The castle was destroyed at a later period, only part of a moss-covered tower now stands. The hunter wore a tight grey jacket, an embroidered belt as wide as one's hand, and a small round cap. He carried a spear in one hand and a crossbow under his arm. His dogs pressed barking into the thicket in which the hunter saw something shining as he came up. It was the cross. Entering the enclosure, he began to call aloud, but the solitary had hidden. She hoped to remain undiscovered. But finally, having no alternative, she made her appearance, bidding him not to be frightened at seeing one who no longer bore the semblance of a human being. As we looked at her, the hunter and I, we saw her surrounded by bright light. She was tall, had a cinch around her waist, and her long grey hair hung over her breast and back. Her feet were rough, her arms quite brown, and she walked bent down by years. In spite of her singular exterior, there was something very noble and imposing about her. She seemed, at first, unwilling to disclose her story. But seeing in the hunter a good, pious man, she said, "I see that thou art a servant of God," and then explained to him how she had come there. She refused to go with him, but begged him to return in a year with a priest who would bring her the Blessed Sacrament. At the time specified, I saw the hunter return with the hermit, a priest, who gave her Holy Communion, after which she asked to be left alone for a while. When they returned, she was dead. They tried to bear away her body, but they could by no means move it, so they interred her on the spot. The hunter secretly took the cross as a memento of the affair. Later on, a chapel was erected over her grave in honor of a saint whom she particularly venerated and whom she had named. On all sides of it were doors. This virgin had lived a life of extreme poverty and entirely hidden in God. Before the pirates' attack, she had had a dream in which she saw herself dragged into the water. In her dream, she made a vow to Our Lady of the Hermits to keep perpetual fast in solitude, if she were saved. Then she suddenly found herself in a canal or sewer, along which she crept until she reached the wilderness in which she afterward really lived, and where she was told she should remain. When she asked on what she should subsist, figs and chestnuts fell from the trees. As she gathered them, they turned to precious stones, the fruits of her penance and mortification. As she related this prophetic dream to the hunter, I saw every circumstance of it. She was a Swiss by birth, and she had been just 30 years in the wilderness when the hunter discovered her. She told him that she was from Switzerland, as he might find on inquiry, and she named her birthplace. She had always had great confidence in Our Lady of the Hermits, and from her childhood she had heard a voice, urging her to leave her home and serve God in solitude. To this, however, she had paid little attention. At last, a youth appeared to her saying, "What? Still here? Not yet set out?" And he led her away. She thought it all a dream. But on awaking, she found herself in another country, far from her home. She entered the little convent of recluses among whom she was well received. The hunter kept the cross devoutly for some time, and then gave it to a man who lived in a town across the mountains. He too prized it very highly and always prayed before it. He attributed to it his own preservation and that of his property during a tempest that destroyed the whole town. At his death it passed to his heirs and, at last, fell into the hands of a peasant who sold it with other effects. But misfortune followed this transaction, for the man lost all that he possessed. Then I saw the precious cross thrown aside with all sorts of things among people who thought little of the fear of God. A stranger, with no fixed principles of faith, purchased it from them not through piety, but through pure curiosity. He knew not the treasure he acquired, and yet it brought him great good. Here the pilgrim makes the following remark in his journal. This last incident refers to the pilgrim himself who, at a time in which he lived in deplorable blindness, purchased the reliquary at Landshut from an old clothes dealer. Sister Emmerich knew nothing of this by human means. Therefore, if her last remark is beyond questioning, why should we hesitate to receive as authentic all that refers to this singular story? Then, as if deeply impressed by the invalid's supernatural knowledge, he exclaimed, "How wonderfully are all things preserved in the treasury of God! Nothing is lost, nothing annihilated, nothing comes to pass without design. All is eternal in the mind of God. Now do I understand why God must punish every idle word. The thought of my sin saddens me. Does this evil exist eternally? Are a man's sins visible after penance, after repentance?" And Sister Emmerich answers, "No, Jesus Christ atones for them. They no longer exist. I never see them, unless when they are intended to serve as an example. For instance, the sin of David. But sins that have never been expiated, sins that a man carries around with him shut up in his heart, I clearly see. The expiated are like footprints in the sand, which the next step, the step of repentance, effaces. The contrite confession of sin blots out sin." An infant martyr of Sachsenhausen. The pilgrim presented a relic to Sister Emmerich which she had already designated as belonging to a hermit. After a few days, she related the following vision of a child, a relative of the old hermit, who had been martyred by the Jews. "I have had an apparition of a child about 4 years old, surrounded by the martyr's rosy aureola. There was something wonderfully attractive about him. His words were few, but full of wisdom. I went a long journey with him, and I was deeply impressed on seeing the little boy so brilliant with light, so grave, and so wise. We passed over a city, and I was instantly conscious of its state. I felt that its pious souls were few. The child led me over a bridge and showed me the house in which he was born, a tolerably large, old-fashioned dwelling. All was still within. On our approach, the inmates thought of the little boy, a faint remembrance of their history recurred to them, and I was told that the sudden remembrance of the dead often arises from their proximity. The child showed me that, as the union between the soul and the body never ceases, not even after death, so the influence of a holy soul never ceases to be exerted over all belonging to it by ties of blood. A saint continues his influence over his family and, in proportion to their faith and piety, do they profit by it. He told me also of the salutary influence he had exercised over his relatives, and that he had attained by martyrdom to that perfection to which he would have arrived, if his life had not been cut short by man's wickedness. Yet more, his relatives had profited spiritually by the influence he would have exercised had he lived, instead of being snatched away in his 4th year. Evil happens not by the will of God, but only by his permission, and the accomplishment of good, prevented by another's sin, is not wholly frustrated. It is effected most surely, but in a different way. Crime in its essential consequences attacks its author only. As to its innocent victims, martyrdom leads them all the more speedily to perfection. Though sin against another be an act directly opposed to the law of God, yet the designs of God are never frustrated, since all that the victim would have achieved during life, he accomplishes spiritually and with the same freedom of will. Then I saw the history of the martyred child. His parents were very pious people who lived about 300 years ago, at Sachsenhausen, near Frankfurt. They had a near relative in Egypt, an Emmerich, whom they regarded with great affection and veneration. They frequently remarked, as they looked on their child, how happy they would be if he, too, would one day lead a holy life and serve God in solitude. Surely, parents who could form such a desire for an only child, still in his 1st year, must have been persons of more than ordinary piety. When the child had attained his 1st year, one of his parents died. The other married again, and still in the new family continued to speak of the hermit and of the child's following his example. The little fellow was often entertained with this plan for his future. At last his only surviving parent died, and the little boy was now an orphan. The hermit continued to be spoken of in the family, and the child, now 4 years old, earnestly longed to see him. He told me that he was a beautiful child, but by no means so beautiful as I now beheld him, and that, had he lived, he would have been very good, perhaps a hermit. His step-parents, who saw in him an heir of the family, were nothing loath to get rid of him. They secretly encouraged him in his desire to walk in his pious relative's footsteps, and, when not quite 4 years old, they entrusted him to some foreign Jews who were journeying to Egypt. This they did to make away with him. The plea of sending him to his relative was only a cloak for their treachery. Although this step led to his martyrdom, yet the child ever loved his family and country. A feast was going on in the old-fashioned house. I thought it was a wedding, but the child told me that it was a local festival. I saw numbers of brilliantly lighted apartments filled with elegantly dressed people dancing and feasting. Thus they make merry, said the child, over the bones of their ancestor who, by his piety, laid the foundation of their affluence. Then he took me to a walled-up vault where lay a white, well-preserved skeleton on a neatly arranged couch in a double coffin. The inner one of lead, the outer of some kind of dark wood. This was the progenitor of the family and a near relative of the child. He had been a very pious man, and had amassed great wealth, without detriment to his piety. When the church in which he had been interred was destroyed, his children deposited his body in this vault, for he now lay wholly forgotten. I went through the whole house. In this city I saw numbers of sacred bones in vaults over which had once stood convents and churches, but whose sites were now occupied by dwellings. The child told me that the city would soon decline, for it had now reached the summit of pride. Then he left me. I traveled far across the sea into a hot sandy country where he again joined me in a ruined city whose houses seemed to be toppling down on one another. In a cave under a hill, he showed me the place of his martyrdom. It looked like a slaughterhouse. In the walls were iron hooks from which the Jews had hung the child, as from a cross, and slowly bled him to death. On the ground yet lay the bones of many other martyred children, shining like sparks. It seemed as if no one knew of this place, and the martyrdom of the child had never been discovered or punished. There were no Christians there, only a few hermits who lived in the desert and occasionally visited the city. Then I went into the desert and again met the child martyr under the palm trees by the hermit's grave, in the same spot in which he had lived. He had died before his young relative had left Frankfurt. His remains were luminous. Several others were buried in this desert, and around in the white sand laid pieces of some kind of black stuff, like broken pottery. Here the child again left me, and I was taken over the sea to another place, to a hill near the city which contains the marketplace Rome. On one side stand houses with grapevines here and there, and under it is a spacious vault upheld by columns. The entrance is closed, no one knows of its existence. As I entered, the child martyr again appeared to me and I found a rich treasure of holy bones. The whole cave was lighted up by them. There were entire bodies in coffins standing against the walls and numberless bones in smaller caskets. I set to work to dust and open them. In one of them I found a body whose winding sheet was perfect wherever it had touched the holy remains, whilst all the rest was fallen to dust. And in others the bodies were thoroughly dried up and as white as snow. I saw by my visions of the life of these saints that most of them belonged to the early ages. Some had been martyred for making offerings to Christian priests and, I think, they were denounced by their pagan relatives. I saw them going along with little birds under their arms. I saw multitudes who had become religious by the vow of chastity, and married couples who, for the love of Jesus, had lived in continence. I turned to a square shallow casket to which I was irresistibly attracted. I felt as if it belonged to me, for there I found all my own saints, all whose relics I have here. I wanted to bring it away with me, but the child said no, it must stay where it was, and so I covered it with a blue veil. The relics were all arranged on little cushions. The child told me that they had lain there concealed since the early ages and that there they were to stay. But the time will come when they will be brought to light. Relics belonging to churches in Munster sent by Dean Overberg. Dean Overberg had sent to Munster at various times packages of relics, some encased and labelled, others without either label or wrapping. Sister Emmerich had first a general vision of them, and afterward, as the feasts of the different saints occurred, she received more particular information concerning each. She says, "When I received those relics from Dean Overberg, I saw in vision with what solemnity they had been brought from Rome to Munster, mostly by bishops, and with what veneration they had been received and distributed. I saw devout women assembling together to fold and ornament them, and I saw the priests who divided them. To be allowed to share this labor, one had to be most pure and holy. The relics were glued, surrounded by embroidery and flowers, and arranged in pyramids. The first time they were exposed for veneration was a grand festival. The whole city rejoiced. I saw that many sacred relics were put into the altars of the Oberwasser church. I saw devout canons of the cathedral who, whenever they heard of a saint, or holy person, tried to get a relic of the same. This they honored as a great treasure. When the church was rebuilt, the relics of the different altars were mixed and the members of several of the holy bodies were scattered. Thus it was that the remains of the Holy Maiden of whom I have a bone were discovered. The great blessings diffused around by relics I saw withdrawn when they are treated with neglect. It was not by chance that these bonds fell into Dean Overberg's hands. Without knowing to whom they belong, he gave them the honor due them. How wonderful are the ways of God! Remarks the pilgrim. He willed that these relics should be scattered that they might fall under the supernaturally enlightened eyes of her who knows so well thy value. One day, having taken up the box of relics, her church as she called it, the Apostle St. Thomas appeared to her, and she had a full vision of his journeys and apostolic labors in the Indies. He went from kingdom to kingdom, wrought many miracles, and uttered many prophecies. He set up a stone at a great distance from the sea, made a mark on it, and said, "When the sea flows this far, another will come to propagate the knowledge of Jesus." I saw that he referred to St. Francis Xavier. St. Thomas was pierced with a lance, buried, and afterward disinterred. I think Matthias and Barsabas are among those relics, for I had a short vision of their election to the apostleship. Matthias, though more delicately constituted, had more strength of soul, and he was, therefore, preferred by God to Barsabas, who was young and vigorous. I saw many things concerning the latter. I had also a vision of Saint Simeon, a blood relative of Jesus. He became Bishop of Jerusalem after Saint James, and suffered martyrdom when over 100 years old. There must be a relic of him here. Next day St. Thomas's relic was pointed out to her in vision. She labelled it and wrapped it in paper. I had visions of his journeys. I saw them as if on a map, and the bones of Simon and Thaddeus, his brother, were shown me. Then I saw the whole family of Saint Anne. She had 3 husbands. Joachim died before the birth of Christ. After his death Anne married twice and had 2 daughters. I was greatly astonished to hear of these marriages, but I was told the reason of her contracting them. Then I thought of Anna whom I once saw, as well as all the lodgings of the widows and virgins in the temple. Saint Anne's first daughter was Mary Alpheus, who at the birth of the Most Holy Virgin had a tolerably large daughter, Mary, afterward the wife of Cleopas, by whom she had 4 sons, James the Less, Simon, Thaddeus, and Joseph Barsabas. I have bones of the last 3. In the presence of their relics I felt that they were united to Jesus by consanguinity. I had also a vision of Jesus going to Abgaris, in Edessa. He carried a writing in his hand which Thomas had given him. As he entered I saw a radiant apparition of the Saviour at his side, before which the sick king inclined, taking no notice of the apostle, whom he saw not. But the latter laid his hand upon him and cured him. After this he preached in the city and converted all the inhabitants. Have again had visions of different saints. I saw the martyrdom of one Saint Evodius who, with Hermogenes, his brother, and a sister, suffered in Sicily. I saw also many pictures of a holy white-robed nun, the Cistercian, Catherine of Parcham. I saw her still a Jewess, reading from rolls of parchment things relating to Jesus which deeply affected her. Some Christian children told her of the child Jesus, of Mary and the crib, to which they took her secretly, and she was still more drawn to Jesus. She received instructions privately and, in consequence of an apparition of Mary, fled to a convent. I saw many other touching things concerning her, especially her longing to be despised. This saint's relic was firmly sewed in red velvet, and when Sister Emmerich took it to label and wrap, she saw, being in contemplation, that it contained the scrap of stuff that touched the Saviour's crib, some splinters of the same, and a ticket on which all was marked. This relic of the crib was one that had belonged to Saint Catherine herself and had been particularly honored by her, for she had seen in a vision the infant Saviour lying in his crib, and she often had the honor of holding him in her arms. All the above Sister Emmerich related to the pilgrim before opening the little package. Judge of his satisfaction, then, when on removing the covering, he found just what she had described, some scraps of word, wrapped in a piece of brown stuff, with the inscription, Dipsipio Christi. Sister Emmerich had fallen into ecstasy, and, when the pilgrim offered her the scraps of word, she took them smilingly, saying, "Ah, these belong to the crib of our Lord." The little nun used to venerate them. The pilgrim, seized with a feeling of veneration for the favored being before him, made a movement as if to kiss her hand. But she suddenly withdrew it with the words, "You kiss Saint Clare's relic. That is no longer of this earth. This," raising her hand, "is still earthly." At these words he was still more astonished, for he had in his breast pocket a relic of Saint Clare which he had not yet shown her. He now presented it to her. She kissed it, exclaiming, "Oh, there is Clare beside me." When returned to consciousness, she said, "I had a little vision of Saint Clare." War was raging round her convent and, although she was ill, she had herself borne to the gate. She carried in her hands the Blessed Sacrament in an ivory box lined with silver. Here she knelt with all her nuns invoking God, when she heard an interior voice bidding her not to fear, and I saw the enemy departing from the city. One day, the pilgrim drew near her bed with a relic from the casket which she had not yet seen. "Afra!" she exclaimed joyously. "Have we Saint Afra? I see her bound hand and foot to a stake. Oh, how the flames dance around her!" She turns her head to look, and with these words Sister Emmerich seized the relic, which she kissed and venerated as belonging to Saint Afra. Toward dusk that same day, the pilgrim opened another of the little parcels on which were inscribed the words, "From the clothing of a saint," and which contained also a bone and a label. It was almost dark and the objects were so very small that he did not imagine Sister Emmerich noticed his action. To his surprise, she called to him, "Take care of the label. The relic shines, it is authentic." He handed her the particle of bone, when she instantly fell into contemplation. On returning to herself she said, "I have been far away to Bethany, Jerusalem, and France. The bone belongs to Martha. The clothing, to Magdalene. It is blue with yellow flowers and green leaves, the remnants of her vanity, which she wore under a mourning mantle, in Bethany fire, at the raising of Lazarus. This dress remained in Lazarus's house when he and his sisters went to France, and pious friends took it as a memento. Some pilgrims, when visiting their tomb in France, wrapped this relic in a part of the dress, thinking both belonged to Magdalene. But only the clothing is hers, the relic is Martha's. When the pilgrim closely examined the inscription, he, indeed, found Sancta Maria Magdalena among these relics of Dean Overberg's. Sister Emmerich recognized a bone of Pope Sixtus VIII, and another of the third pope after Peter. She appeared pleased at having been able to decipher the numbers. But next day she said, "When I again saw the saints to whom the relics belong, it was said to me, not the third, but the 13th. His name signifies Savior." "How wonderful!" exclaims the pilgrim. The 13th pope is Soter, the Greek for Savior. Father Limburg presented her a little package marked Saint Clement, asking if it really was a relic of Pope Saint Clement. Sister Emmerich laid it by her and next day answered, "No, it was not Saint Clement's, but one of Saint Marcella, widow." The confessor asked for more precise details. After some days, the invalid gave the following: "I have again seen the life of Saint Marcella. I saw her as a widow living very retired in a beautiful large house built in Roman style, like St. Cecilia's. Around it were gardens, courtyards, and fountains. I often saw St. Jerome with her opening rolls of writings. Marcella gave all she had to the poor and to prisoners whom she used to visit by night, the prison doors opening of themselves to admit her. She was deeply impressed on reading the life of St. Anthony that she put on a veil and the monastic dress, and influenced young maidens to do the same. I saw a strange people enter and pillage Rome. They tried to extort money from Marcella by blows, but she had given all to the poor. This is all I remember. The first time I saw her, she encouraged me respecting my visions on the Holy Scriptures and told me something for my confessor. But I have entirely forgotten it." Another relic she recognized as belonging to Saint Marcellus, of whom she related the following: "I had a vision of the saint. He used to go with his companions by night to hunt up the bodies of the martyrs and give them Christian burial, inscribing their names over their resting places. I often saw him going around by night with bones in his mantle. He carried also many holy bodies into the catacombs, laid rolls of writings by them, principally the acts of their martyrdom, and marked them. I think it was he who brought many of the things into the great vault in which I once saw so many relics preserved. I remarked again that we have many precious relics here, for many belong to bodies that Marcellus labeled. I have seen the holy widow Lucina. She begged him to bury 2 martyrs who had long before perished of hunger in prison. During the night he and Lucina bore the remains of a man and a woman to the place where Lawrence lay buried. But, as they attempted to lay them by him, the bones of St. Lawrence recoiled, as if unwilling to have them near him, and so they buried them elsewhere. I saw Marcellus led before the emperor. On his refusal to offer sacrifice, he was scourged to blood and sent to take charge of a large stable. The stable was circular, built around the court, and there were in it not only beasts of burden, but also cages for the beasts intended to be let loose upon the martyrs. These Marcellus had to feed, but they were tame and gentle with him. Here, too, he found means to assist his brethren in secret. Through the intervention of Lucina, who bribed the jailers, he often left the prison by night to bury the dead and encourage the faithful. I saw, too, that he received the Blessed Sacrament from other priests and distributed it by night. He was, at last, liberated, again imprisoned, and again liberated for having cured the wife of a great personage. After this he lived retired in the house of Lucina, which he secretly converted into a church, and wherein he practiced, as usual, his works of mercy. But his enemies again attacked him, turned the house into a stable, and condemned him to serve in it. As he still persevered in his spiritual labors for souls, they had him horribly scourged with the whips used for the beasts of burden. He died in a corner of the stable, on the ground, and the Christians gave him burial. After this I had visions of Ambrose, Liborius, and of St. Gregory's pontificate. They referred chiefly to the communications of these saints with holy women, which had given rise to many calumnies. Gregory established numerous convents of nuns. On the ancient pagan festivals, public prayers were offered and penances performed by hundreds of their members clothed as penitents, to repair the scandals then committed. A great deal of good was thus effected and the number of festivals consecrated to the demon and sin was thereby diminished. But Saint Gregory had much to suffer from it. I saw also a picture of a certain deacon Syriacus, who suffered unspeakably. Once he lay hidden and almost starving in the catacombs not far from where St. Peter's now stands. He was, later on, martyred. I remember that the deacon Syriacus received orders from Marcellus, and that, with 2 Christians, Largus and Smaragdus, he assisted the faithful condemned to labor at the public works. He was himself afterward condemned to do the same. He delivered the daughter of his persecutor from the power of the devil. I recognized the bones of Plaster and Donatus, the former of whom was as elegant in appearance as St. Francis de Sales. He was martyred in Sicily with his brothers. I saw many scenes of his life, particularly of his infancy. He was the youngest of 5 children, 3 brothers and 1 sister older than himself. Even as a child, he was looked upon as a saint. I saw him, an infant in his mother's arms, seize a roll of writings and joyously lay his tiny hands upon the names of Jesus and Mary. He was universally loved. Often whole families gathered round him on his mother's knee. Then I saw him as a boy in the garden with his pious tutor, where he amused himself tracing crosses in the sand, or weaving them of flowers and leaves, the birds hopping familiarly about him. When older he was taken to another place to make his studies, and afterward to the convent of St. Benedict, which still had a few scholars. He was slender, handsome, and rapidly developing into a most distinguished-looking youth. At the same time, I had a vision of another saint of very low condition in life, reared as a herdsman, but who afterward became pope. I saw the life of each side by side. I spoke with Placidus and he again promised me help, telling me that I had only to invoke him when I wanted him and he would surely come. One day the pilgrim drew Sister Emmerich's attention to the fact that St. Teresa's feast was at hand, adding, "We have a relic of her here, also one of Catherine of Siena. There they lie among several others," whereupon she began and named in their order the saints whose relics hung in a cross at the foot of her bed. "I see their names, either at their feet or by their side, and I see, too, their attributes. There is Adiltrudis with the crown she resigned, and there are Teresa, Radegonda, Genevieve, Catherine, Phocas, and Mary Clippers. The last named is taller than Mary, but dressed in the same style. She is the daughter of Mary's eldest sister. And there I see Ambrose, Urban, and Sylvanus." The pilgrim asked, "Where is Pelagia?" and she answered, "She is not by me any more, she is there," pointing to the pilgrim's breast pocket, where indeed, the relic really was, he having taken it to fold and label as one already recognized. The same was the case with another which he still had about him for a similar purpose. As he approached her she cried out, "I see Engelbert. Have we his relics too?" The pilgrim handed her the relics and next day she said, "I recognize that relic. It belongs to Engelbert of Cologne. Last night I saw many incidents of his life. He was very influential at court, where he was occupied with important diplomatic affairs. He led an upright, fervent life. But on account of his position, he was not so much given to interior things as other saints. His devotion to Mary was very great. I saw him busy in the cathedral, arranging in caskets precious relics no longer known and burying they all together under the altars. But that was not proper. I saw his death. He was attacked whilst on a journey and horribly maltreated by a relative whom he had once been obliged to punish. I counted over 70 wounds on his body. He was sanctified by his earnest preparation for death, for he had shortly before made a fervent general confession. The unspeakable patience with which he endured his slow murder also contributed thereto, for he never ceased praying for his assassins. The Mother of God was with him visibly consoling and encouraging him to suffer and die patiently. He was indebted to her for his holy death. I have also recognized the relic of Saint Cunibert of Cologne. I saw him as a boy sleeping near King Dagobert. Amen.